Margot and Lucy live together, and they have 2 young kids. They both also have other romantic partners, but Lucy has been dating someone new. His name is Greg, and that new relationship is triggering some insecurity in Margot. One morning after a planned overnight with Greg, Lucy doesn't come home at the time she told Margot that she would. As she's leaving his house, Greg and Lucy get into a deep conversation and she loses track of time. And her phone died overnight because she forgot her charger, and the conversation was just intense. Margot, meanwhile, is home alone with the kids, waiting for some parenting backup to arrive. And when Lucy doesn't show up, Margot gets worried. And then she gets even more worried when she texts Lucy and is getting no response. And when Lucy steps in the door of their house a full 2 hours later than she said she'd be home, Margot is furious. I want you to put yourself in this situation because this is common. This is something that we've probably all experienced in some kind of way. One partner screwing up with another one, saying they'd do one thing and then something else happens instead. And this isn't even exclusive to polyamory. I mean, replace being on a date with staying late at the office or out with friends. You can turn this story into a lot of different stories that we've all had. The facts of the story aren't as important as what people in the story do with their whoosh. What do I mean by whoosh? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to Making Polyamory Work. Hi, I'm Libby Sinback, and I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I'm a queer polyamorous mom and a relationship coach. I'm here to help you if you're feeling stuck, if you're struggling, if you want your relationships to be more nourishing, more functional, more authentic, and full of love. On this show, I go deep into what actually makes polyamorous relationships work, because relationships are at the core of our well-being as humans. I think love is why we're here and how we heal. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm sorry if I sound a little cruddy. I've been fighting off this cold for a little while. It sort of went away over the weekend while I was at Winter Poly Wonderland, which was marvelous in West Virginia. But now it seems to have come back a little bit. My next travels, by the way, are taking me to Atlanta to teach a relationship transitions class on February 29th. And then I will be at Southwest Love Fest in April, the first weekend in April, and that's in Tucson, Arizona. And then lastly, at the end of April, I will be at RelateCon in Boise, Idaho. If you are thinking about attending any of the events, but you're on the fence, I encourage you to get off that fence because these events are all amazing and I would love to see you there. So that's all the announcements I've got. So let's dig in to today's topic. So going back to the Lucy and Margot story that I just told, if you were Margot in this situation, what would you do? Well, I can tell you what I probably would have done in the past, which is that I probably would have let Lucy have it. I would have been like, where were you? I was worried sick. How come you didn't text? I can't believe you left me with the kids for 2 hours and having no idea where you are. My plans for the day are all messed up now. Blah, 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 blah. Maybe that's not what you would do, though. Maybe you would act super cold towards Lucy when she got home and act withdrawn and distant and just sort of let her know how you feel without saying a word. Or maybe you wouldn't directly express your hurt and upset, but you'd get like super passive aggressive and snappish and irritable with her. Or maybe you'd demand there on the spot that Lucy stop seeing Greg because it's too disruptive to your lives together. Maybe that's something that would happen. I don't know. And if you're Lucy, well, again, if it were me, in the past, I might have quickly apologized and explained my mistake, explained what happened, explained why it wasn't a big deal. And then after I've explained exactly why none of it was intentional, I would probably insist that Margot get over her upset feelings. Maybe you, if you were Lucy, you might get defensive and, maybe remind Margot of all the times she's been late and hadn't texted and all the times that you kind of just let things go with her. Maybe you'd be the one to withdraw and act like what happened wasn't a big deal and just not engage in the fight. Maybe you'd shut down when Margot would lay into you. Or maybe if Margot, did tell you that it was inconsiderate to come home hours late without texting, you'd just get really hurt that you were being attacked and just completely shut down. In the case of the real Margot and Lucy, Margot did rage at Lucy for being late, and she felt entitled to. This relationship with Greg was already making her feel a bunch of things she didn't feel comfortable about, and here Lucy's lateness was just reinforcing some of those insecure feelings. And she also did bring up every other time that Lucy had been late on a date and saying that this was a clear pattern of hers. And then she drew the line that Greg was causing Lucy to neglect Margot and the kids and that she had just about had it. And Lucy, well, she defended herself at first. She argued the points that Margot was making. She'd messed up. It was true, but it wasn't intentional, and it definitely wasn't a pattern. And that saying Greg was causing Lucy to be a bad mom or a bad partner to Margot was way out of line. And, she just insisted Margot get off her back. And, people lose track of time. It happens. And this didn't go over well with Margot. She just got more enraged. And then Lucy shut down after that. She just completely gave up, withdrew, and then Margot withdrew and walked around the house just seething with resentment, responding irritably whenever she and Lucy had to talk about something about the kids or about the household chores or plans for the day. And Lucy, felt really ashamed and upset but also unfairly punished by this treatment. And so she got really cold and withdrawn and turned away from Margot when Margot was finally feeling like maybe she wanted to connect and cuddle. Lucy wasn't up for it. And that further fed Margot's fears and insecurities about Lucy's new relationship with Greg getting in the way of their relationship. And I'm wondering, as you're hearing this situation, whether you notice yourself taking a side in this conflict that came up with these two people. I mean, I think a lot of people would side with Margot here. She does have every right to be upset. Lucy was late, and she didn't stay on top of her commitments to her family. And yeah, it was an accident, but if she was thinking ahead, she could have brought her charger, made sure that she charged her phone. She could have been conscientious about this conversation with Greg. And, those things are important. But maybe you find yourself siding with Lucy here because maybe you sometimes have a hard time staying on top of all the things, and you do tend to lose track of time and think it's completely out of line to just rip into somebody when they screw up. Where's the grace? Where's the compassion? No matter whose side you find yourself on, Lucy and Margot are in a pretty rough spot. They have a lot they need to talk about and work through and strategize around. But with the way that they're acting right now in this scenario that I've laid out, they can't do any of that. And even when they eventually thaw out and hopefully repair with each other, if they keep going at it like this every time a conflict comes up, it will gradually wear down their relationship. It'll put stress on all of Lucy's outside relationships, probably also Margot's outside relationships, definitely her relationship with Greg. And probably worst of all, it's going to create a tense atmosphere in their household, which is going to be tough on their kids. And while you've heard me talk on this podcast about things like active listening, creating emotional boundaries, moving from complaint to request, standing up for yourself with love, letting go of things people say about you that aren't true, and other strategies, employing any of these things requires a really important first step that I haven't talked about yet, a step that is way more important than any of these other things, and for many people, way, way harder. The first step, the most essential skill that I tell anybody about is to learn to put the brakes on your whoosh. Now, whoosh is a non-technical term that I first heard from Terry Real of the Relational Life Institute, but it goes by many names. I happen to like whoosh better than triggered, which is a word a lot of people use. Scientifically, another word for your whoosh is acute stress response. When I talk about being reactive, being in reactivity, I'm also talking about your whoosh. Now, the acute stress response is actually an involuntary physiological, neurological response to stress. And I do want to talk about that for a minute because I read this meme the other day and it really bugged me. So I'm going to share it with you because you might see some of this kind of information circulating around the internet. And so I'm going to read you the text of this meme. It starts out with a quote. "Although we can't always choose what happens to us, we can choose how to respond." And then underneath that statement, it says, "This statement is false. Being trauma-informed doesn't mean that all existing and long-standing theories of human behavior are accurate. Fight, flight, and freeze behaviors are unconsciously reflexive. We need to stop perpetuating the myth that we are always in conscious control of our actions. It hurts and shames children and adults." I read this and I thought, well, this is true, sort of, but also not true. More importantly, I think it sends the wrong message. First of all, let's leave children out of this conversation because children do not have a fully formed prefrontal cortex. So they are more reactive and less capable of overriding their acute stress responses than adults are. However, I'm just going to say, I still teach my kids that they're responsible for choosing how to respond when they're upset. And here's why. Encouraging them to do this, encouraging them to learn how to pause and reflect and make different choices is how they learn to do it and grow that prefrontal cortex. If I told my kids they weren't responsible for their reactions to situations, they just plain wouldn't mature into functional adults. If you are an adult, and I truly hope you are if you're listening to this podcast, then you do have a fully formed prefrontal cortex. You also probably have a lot of ingrained whoosh responses. The meme is right that they do happen automatically or what feels like automatically. And having these kinds of reactions doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you wrong. It's not worth shaming you over it. You likely developed these whoosh responses before you were old enough to make conscious choices about how to relate to others. But if you want to be able to have a functional, healthy relationship, you have to learn how to deal with them. And if you don't have a good handle on how to do that, you can learn. You just have to train yourself to do something different. This is true even if you have survived serious trauma. In fact, most whoosh responses are created in response to some kind of trauma. And if you don't think that applies to you, I encourage you to actually expand your definition of trauma here, because I think a lot of us tend to downplay traumatic experiences, especially from our childhood, because when we reflect on it now as adults, we think, oh, that wasn't that bad. But kids can be traumatized by things that adults can handle. Another way to look at this, though, is we develop these whoosh responses as an adaptation or a coping strategy to confront challenges that felt too big for us when we were small. Then we practice those over and over and over again as children until they become automatic and feel natural to us as adults. There are a lot of names for this part of us that emerges from those behaviors. Terry Real calls it the adaptive child. Stan Tatkin calls it the primitives, but I find that term really problematic. It's the part of us that comes out when we feel threatened. And neurobiologically speaking, the part of the brain where those responses operate is really deep and moves a lot faster than the part of our brain that can do intentional things like active listening. So I'm going to go back to the meme again because I want to say that I agree that there's no reason to shame anybody for having a stress response. Our stress responses exist for a very good reason, just like our negativity bias. They exist to keep us alive. If your life is actually being threatened, your survival instincts need to act super fast without your conscious thinking brain on. If a bear is chasing you and you have to spend time deliberating about what to do about that, you're likely going to be dead before you decide whether to fight or whether to run. But on the flip side, because these whoosh behaviors are part of our survival system, they're really incompatible with intimacy, nuance, compassion, vulnerability. This part of us is instead focused on right and wrong, black and white thinking. It's perfectionistic, rigid, harsh, certain, and tense. This is the part of you, by the way, that often writes your shitty first drafts. A lot of people think that this part of you, because it goes so deep and acts so fast and it feels automatic, that means that it's the real you. And I really want to disabuse you of this notion. It's certainly part of you. And because it's part of a neurological system that's designed to protect you, it's always going to be there. And there are times that it serves you well in your life. But you also have another part of you to draw from, which is something Terry Real calls second consciousness, or your functional adult. Other people might call it their highest and best self, or your most enlightened self, whatever you want to call it, whatever works for you. It's that part of you that is more nuanced, more realistic, more collaborative, forgiving, flexible, humble, and yielding. This is where grace, magnanimity, and compassion come from. It's where we do our personal growth. It's where we're able to be vulnerable and tender. It's where we create good apologies. It's the intentional part of us rather than the reactive part of us. And it's no less the real us just because it's intentional and slow. Some people I speak to about this don't really know their functional adult self very well because they live in their adaptive child so much. And it's worth saying our social and cultural norms encourage us to live in our adaptive children. Remember, the adaptive child, rigid, self-righteous, focused on black and white thinking, right and wrong, certainty, harshness. If you ever watch a political debate or a reality TV show, this is the behavior that gets rewarded. And I'm inviting you to shed the idea that this kind of stuff is real human nature, or when you behave this way, that's who you really are. And I'm inviting you instead to walk on a very rarefied path than the one our culture has laid out for you. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already down for that in general, walking on a different path than culture lays out for you. So if you're used to letting your whoosh run your relationships, I am now challenging you to try something else radically different. If this sounds overwhelming, I'll tell you that learning how to tame your whoosh and draw on your second consciousness is like any physical discipline. You can train yourself to respond to your nervous system and work on strengthening your mental muscles the same way you can work and strengthen the muscles in your body. Remember, your whoosh response is just a well-worn pathway that your brain has been practicing since you were a child. Once you start shifting how you behave and repeat those shifts, you'll carve a new pathway and quickly you will notice a change, just like if you start a physical practice like yoga. At first, it will be hard. You'll fall back into your whoosh the same way you'll fall out of a new and difficult yoga pose. But over time, you start to get it. And doing it at all can make a huge improvement on your relationships with others. The first step is to identify your whoosh thumbprint. And it's worth saying that your whoosh thumbprint might be different with different people, and it might be different in different kinds of relationships. But it's in your most intimate connections, this is where I'm talking about right now. You need to understand who your adaptive child is, where they came from, and how they operate when you're under stress. I help people figure this out in my coaching practice, but I'll go over some common ones that might line up with how you operate. And again, this is a little oversimplified. It actually can be a lot, very complex. And it's worth adding in that attachment styles tie into this. A lot of times your attachment behaviors and your whoosh behaviors are connected to one another and sometimes are the same thing. But for now, I'm going to break it down with these 5. So first one is fight. So sometimes your whoosh might be like attacking your partner or defensiveness, counterattack, turning things back on your partner, as well as something called unbridled self-expression, where you just kind of go blah at your partner and drag everything and the kitchen sink into the conflict. All of these are fight responses. Sometimes your whoosh might not look like fighting. It might look like withdrawing into your shell, closing off, getting cold, getting passive-aggressive, avoiding the conversation. That is the flee response. And you don't have to physically withdraw to actually flee. You can be right next to someone and be gone. There's also freeze, and that is more like you're a deer in headlights. Words get stuck in your throat. You can't respond. There's also, this is one you may not have heard before, fix. You might not realize that fix can be a stress response, but it can be. If you tend to respond to stress by jumping to solve the problem right away, coming up with a plan, new rules, new directives, figuring out who was correct and who was right and who was wrong, who's owed what, telling your partner what to do and how to feel, or telling them how you're going to make it all better, that is the fix response. If you're in the fix response, you might think you're making things better, but the difference is that in a whoosh state, you're reacting to feeling threatened and looking for safety for yourself rather than responding with vulnerability and compassion for the other person. Lastly, it's worth touching on that there's a fifth one called fawn. And fawn shows up as just placating, profusely apologizing, taking all the responsibility for whatever goes wrong, love bombing your partner, just begging them to be okay. And the fawn response is especially common in survivors of abuse. Both Lucy and Margot's whoosh, in case you couldn't tell, is fight, although Lucy had a pretty quick secondary whoosh response, which was to withdraw and shut down. Margot learned her whoosh from her mom, who was hypercritical and often did something called offending from the victim position. You may know what I'm talking about. Offending from the victim position is when you know you've been wronged, and so you feel entitled to make the other person feel like total shit, attacking them with self-righteous indignation. Lucy's whoosh comes from both of her parents, who routinely would just shut down any sort of difficult conversation, and they avoided conflict with one another and with Lucy. Lucy learned that it was better never to bring anything up or raise any concerns she had, and that it was better to just let things go and be easygoing. So when Margot confronted her, that was like a huge no-no. That was something that didn't happen in Lucy's family, so it was not okay. And because Lucy didn't have any practice confronting difficult things, she just responds to any criticism as though it's an attack, rather than being vulnerable and taking responsibility for what's being said to her. So, and then, when the attack doesn't stop, then there's the shutdown and withdrawal. If you take a look at your thumbprint, you will likely be able to trace back that behavior to something you learned from one or both of your parents or some other situation early in childhood. It also might be that you have managed to pick partners whose whooshes remind you of things that hurt you when you were very young. And obviously that can be very challenging, but it can also be a golden opportunity to practice what I'm going to go through here, which is calming your whoosh. Now that you've identified your whoosh, you can recognize it when you're doing it. And again, don't over-identify with this part of yourself. It was created in you before you were capable of intentionally choosing who you wanted to be. Who you are now, though, that's something you get to work on. And I will tell you, it feels way better to stop playing out your childhood wounds in your adult relationships. But I also don't want you to hate on this part of yourself either and banish it, because it showed up for a reason, usually a very important reason, and it got you through some tough times. So I also don't want you to underestimate the, as Terry Real puts it, the exquisite intelligence of your adaptive child. But here's the thing, to stop this part of yourself from running your relationships, you have to create an intentional practice to disrupt that stress response. Or if you get too far into it, you might need to just complete the stress cycle. When you're in your whoosh, your body believes you're under threat, and it is reacting from that place. So you have to practice telling your body that you're not in danger. Often, the first thing to try is just deep breathing from your belly. You've heard me say this before. Deep breathing from your abdomen, though, presses on the vagus nerve, and that calms your nervous system. You can't deep breathe if you're actually physically being threatened, right? If a lion or a bear is coming at you, if you are being actually attacked in some kind of way, there's no way that you would be able to actually change your breathing. So this works because you're not under threat, so you can change your breathing. As you breathe, remember love. Remember that the person you're interacting with is someone you love, not someone who's trying to hurt you, even if they are hurting you right now. And then as you remember love, as you breathe, open your heart and then try to find how you proceed from that place. Tara Brach calls this process the sacred pause. And it is in that moment that you can reach for that second consciousness, that functional adult, that more mature part of you who can respond instead of react. Sometimes deep breathing won't be enough. If you're really elevated, your heart rate's really up, you're just really, flushed, you're hot, you're shaky, whatever, you might need to take a break. Learning to take a break is an incredibly valuable skill in relationships. And it's also a bit of an art. It's so important to take breaks to stop things from escalating, but it's also important to do it such that it doesn't feel like a punishment or that it doesn't result in you getting chased. Later this week, I'm going to release an episode on specifically how to take responsible distance in a difficult situation because it really deserves its own episode. During your break, you also have to be very intentional about how you disrupt or complete your stress response. For some people, the work is top down, meaning they engage in mindfulness, more deep breathing, some meditation, do some mindset shifts, focus inward on their own part of the situation, do some self-reflection. But for some of you, that may not work, and you may need to work the response through your body rather than focusing on your thoughts. And this might be especially true for you if your stress response is fight and you have a lot of rage. You may need to punch a pillow or sing loudly or go for a run or do some push-ups to tell your body that you fought off the lion, as Emily Nagoski puts it, in order to calm down and for your body to know that it's safe. And it's going to take some trial and error to figure out the best strategy for getting yourself out of your whoosh. It's going to be really different depending on you and what your body does during your whoosh and what your responses are and what the triggers are, all of that stuff. Probably the first step of the process is going to just start to notice what your whoosh is, what it feels like in your body, when it happens, and what triggers it. You might start learning then to catch yourself in the middle of it. And you might make some progress stopping it altogether, and then you'll slide back into it and lose your shit. So I encourage you to be gentle with yourself here, because for so long, if you haven't been practicing this, you've been doing your whoosh without thinking. And I want to just add here that this isn't asking you to stuff your feelings. It's asking you to not explode your feelings on your partner, or I'm not asking you to connect when you don't feel like it. I'm asking you not to withdraw from a place of fear. It's that I'm working on here. It's not that I don't want you to have your feelings, have a constructive conversation about conflict. This is not about avoiding conflict. It's actually about making conflict safer for everyone by calming down your survival instinct. And you do have to intentionally practice this, because if you don't, then things will not get better. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I know I'm supposed to take a break when things get elevated, but then they don't actually take a break. They might say they're going to take a break, but then they're texting each other back and forth their rage instead of having it in person. You have to take the break. You have to take the breath. It's easy to agree that you need to do that, but it's hard to actually do and practice. Just the same way it's hard to get up early in the morning if you're not used to getting up early in the morning. You have to practice it. And the hurdle to start practicing is going to be high. You have to practice. But as you practice, you'll get better and it will get easier. And your body will feel different when you're in your functional adult. And you'll start to recognize how different it feels and how much lighter you end up feeling and how much more energy you have. And soon it will be more familiar to you to pause and not let your whoosh take you over than it will be to lean into your whoosh and let someone have it. Some things that might get in the way of you taming your whoosh include things like if you've had a lot of stress in your life overall, so you felt stuck in survival mode. If this is you, you have a hard road. And I encourage you to get some support, either a therapist or a coach or someone to help you work on this. I have so much empathy in the world because when everything is overwhelming in your life, thinking about creating an intentional practice like this can feel inaccessible. However, the research is clear. Learning how to create supportive, intimate relationships can actually help you regulate your external stress. Connection to others is one of the biggest factors in mental health and physical health and longevity, whereas stress will make you physically and mentally sick and send you to an early grave. You also may have a hard time taming your whoosh if you have historically put a lot of energy into avoiding your whoosh or asking your partners or loved ones to take responsibility for managing your whoosh. And so if you've been saying, well, don't trigger me, like don't do these things that trigger me. That's the work that we're doing here. Or when I have the whoosh, it's your job to completely shut down your whoosh and just manage mine. This actually is all really common, but it is just keeping the part of you that needs to become stronger instead in a highly brittle and fragile state. And to this last point of avoidance, some tactics for avoiding triggers in polyamorous relationships include, guess what I'm going to say, rules and agreements. This is why when I said that when you're starting out in non-monogamy, if you're creating a lot of rules and agreements, you might be setting yourself up to fail. Because if you're making rules and agreements to avoid a bad thing from happening that might trigger you because your whoosh responses are out of control, what you're doing there is you're letting your adaptive child part of you run your relationship, and you're using it to control your partner. And it means also that when the rule or agreement is broken or isn't working or needs to be adjusted, it's likely going to be a really destructive thing that comes up in your relationship because you won't have the tools to deal with your whoosh. I'll talk more about what to do instead of agreements and rules in a later episode, because I'm not saying that, you don't get any bumpers if you need some when you're starting out on this. But for now, I want you to focus on taming your whoosh rather than trying to create structures to avoid it. The reality is, no one can ever or will ever love us perfectly. To go back to Margot and Lucy, no question, Lucy fucked up, but that doesn't mean it's helpful or useful for Margot to lay into her. It might feel good in the moment, and it might even feel true and honest to how Margot's actually feeling, but that doesn't actually make it any better. It doesn't get Margot what she needs, and it doesn't help Lucy not fuck up again. It could actually make things a whole lot worse. So what would make things better for Margot is for her to learn to tame her reactivity. Then she would be able to access the part of herself that can stand up for herself with love, use the feedback wheel to share how Lucy's behavior impacted her and ask for what would make it better, and then collaborate with Lucy on strategies to avoid that kind of thing happening in the future. And in order for Lucy to be accountable and make a good repair, she needs to be able to listen to Margot with an open heart and also without beating herself up. And they can both only do that if they learn to tame their whoosh. So to recap, learning how to tame your whoosh will help you navigate difficult conversations with love and skill. And if you don't learn how to tame your whoosh, all the relationship skills in the world probably won't help you very much. To tame your whoosh, you first need to identify it and then learn to disrupt it by taking a breath, taking a sacred pause, or taking time out to calm your body down. Acting out of your whoosh won't help you confront problems, and avoiding your whoosh will just lead to fragility. Learning this skill is the basic building block of every other relationship skill that I have to offer. It's a huge key to having functional, loving adult relationships. Containing your whoosh and instead living more from the functional adult part of you sets you on a very different path than the path that our broader culture models for us. It's radically compassionate and deeply vulnerable. It's also an ongoing relational practice, but the sooner you start and the more you practice, the easier it will get. And it will take you on a path of greater ease and deeper love in all of your relationships. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any thoughts about what I've said or a question for the show, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me on my website at libbysinback.com, or you can just email me at libby@libbysinback.com. You can also find me on Facebook. Just look for my name, Libby Sinback, and you can like my page, and that's where you can keep track of any of the things that I am up to. I'll also say that if you're loving my podcasts, but maybe feeling a little stuck on how to really bring some of the things I'm saying into practice in your life, and you'd like some help, this is the kind of thing I help my coaching clients do every day. If you're interested, I am offering my podcast listeners a free introductory session with me to see if coaching might be a good fit. There's a link in the podcast description for you to sign up, or you can just go to www.talktolibby.com. Slots are limited though, so make sure you grab one if you want it. If you love this podcast, please share it with your friends, your networks, your Facebook groups, etc., and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. It would also be a big help if you left a review or a comment on iTunes, because that will help more people find the show. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I will see you soon.